The blizzard outside was a starving beast, but the silence inside the fortress was far more dangerous. Emily pushed against the massive iron doors, her frozen fingers slipping against the cold wood. She stepped into the great hall, the air heavy with the scent of pine smoke and old steel. At the far end, Jaden sat motionless. He was the Alpha King, a man rumored to have a heart of jagged ice. His cold blue eyes pinned her to the stone floor. She had come only to mend his torn cloak, but as he stood, his massive frame casting a shadow over her tiny form, Emily realized the truth. She hadn't just walked into a fortress. She had walked into a trap from which there was no return. The wind swept harshly across the stone courtyard. Emily pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. She kept her gaze fixed on the icy cobblestones. Guards with iron spears watched her approach the main keep. They did not offer to open the heavy oak doors. Emily pushed against the rough wood with all her remaining strength. The heavy door groaned and yielded just enough for her to slip inside. Wards hit her face immediately. It was a sharp contrast to the brutal winter outside. She stood in the great hall of the northern fortress. The room was vast and mostly empty. A massive hearth blazed at the far end of the room. A man sat alone at a long wooden table. They called him the Alpha King. Jaden had earned that title through years of ruthless military campaigns. He was not a myth or a beast. He was simply a mortal warlord who had never lost a battle. Emily swallowed hard and took a hesitant step forward. Her worn leather boots made a soft, scuffling sound. Jaden did not look up from the parchment maps spread before him. His broad shoulders were tense beneath a simple black tunic. "You are the seamstress," he said. His voice was deep and carried easily across the large room. Emily stopped walking. "Yes, my lord," she replied. Her voice trembled slightly. She hated herself for showing fear. Jaden gestured vaguely toward a wooden bench near the fire. A heavy woolen cloak rested there. It was dark gray and stained with mud. A jagged tear ripped through the left shoulder. "Mend it," Jaden commanded. He still did not look at her. Emily walked quietly toward the bench. She knelt on the stone floor beside the heavy fabric. Her fingers were entirely numb from the long walk. She opened her small wooden sewing box. Inside sat her only tools. She retrieved a sturdy iron needle and a spool of thick thread. She tried to thread the needle. Her hands shook uncontrollably. The thread missed the eye of the needle 3 times. Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She forced her muscles to steady. On the 4th attempt, the thread slid through. She tied a small knot and smoothed the torn edges of the cloak. The fabric smelled of pine smoke and old iron. She pushed the needle through the thick wool. It required more force than she anticipated. She pressed her thumb hard against the metal. The needle popped through the other side. She pulled the thread taut. She repeated the motion. The hall fell into a heavy silence. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the soft hiss of thread pulling through wool. Jaden finally lifted his head. He stared across the room at the woman working by the hearth. He saw a fragile figure swallowed by the oversized shadows of the room. Her dark hair was tied back loosely. Her dress was heavily patched and faded. She looked like a strong gust of wind would break her bones. Yet, she worked with an unyielding rhythm. Every stitch was precise. Every movement was calculated. She did not glance around the wealthy hall. She did not look at him. She simply focused entirely on the torn fabric. Jaden leaned back in his heavy wooden chair. He rubbed his tired eyes. He had spent the last 3 days managing a border dispute. He was exhausted and entirely out of patience. He had expected the village elder to send an experienced tailor. Instead, they sent this quiet, starving girl. He could see the sharp line of her jaw. Her cheeks were hollow. She was clearly underfed. Suddenly, a loud grumble echoed in the quiet room. Emily froze. Her needle stopped midair. Her stomach betrayed her hunger with another loud rumble. A deep flush of shame crept up her neck and colored her pale cheeks. She bit her bottom lip. She lowered her head further over the cloak. She desperately hoped the king had not heard it. Jaden heard it perfectly. He frowned slightly. He looked away from her and stared at the flames. He did not mock her. He did not say a word. He simply reached for a small silver bell on his table. He rang it once. The sharp chime broke the silence. Emily flinched at the sudden noise. A side door opened instantly. A servant bowed from the doorway. Jaden waved a hand dismissively. "Bring wood for the fire," Jaden ordered. He paused for a fraction of a second. "And bring the roasted meat from the kitchens." The servant bowed again and vanished. Emily kept her eyes firmly on her work. She pushed the needle through the tuft of fabric again. Her fingers ached horribly. The warmth of the fire was making her frozen skin sting. She welcomed the pain. It meant she was thawing. She finished the first row of stitches. She smoothed the seam with her thumb. It was perfectly flat and strong. She began the second reinforcement row. Her vision blurred slightly. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. She blinked hard to clear her sight. She could not afford to make a mistake. This job paid 1 silver coin. 1 silver coin meant firewood and bread for an entire month. She had to finish the task perfectly. The side door opened again. The servant returned carrying a large iron tray. The smell of roasted lamb filled the great hall instantly. Emily stopped breathing for a moment. Her mouth watered violently. Her stomach cramped with painful hunger. She forced herself to exhale slowly. She drove the needle back into the wool. The servant placed the tray on Jaden's table. He also placed a large loaf of crusty bread next to the meat. "Leave it," Jaden said. The servant left the room. Jaden picked up a small hunting knife. He sliced a generous piece of the lamb. He did not eat it. He set the knife down. He looked across the room at Emily. She was sewing faster now. Her posture was rigid. She was trying to ignore the food. It was a pathetic and admirable display of pride. Jaden stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. Emily's shoulders tensed. She heard his heavy footsteps approaching. He walked slowly. He stopped a few feet away from her. Emily did not stop sewing. She was terrified he was coming to inspect the work early. She tied off the thread quickly. She reached for her iron scissors to cut the loose end. Her trembling hand knocked the scissors off the bench. They clattered loudly against the stone floor. Emily gasped quietly. She scrambled onto her knees to retrieve them. A large, scarred hand beat her to it. Jaden picked up the scissors. Emily knelt there, looking at his muddy leather boots. She slowly tilted her head up. She met his gaze for the first time. His eyes were a startling, cold blue. His face was weathered and marked by an old battle scar. He looked terrifying. He held out the scissors. Emily reached out with shaking fingers. She took the scissors from his palm. "Thank you, my lord," she whispered. Jaden looked at her hands. They were red, raw, and trembling. He looked at the cloak on the bench. The repair was flawless. It was stronger than the original weave. He looked back at her face. She was still waiting for his judgment. "The light is fading," Jaden said. His voice held no warmth, but no anger either. "You will ruin your eyes." Emily clutched the scissors tightly. "I am almost finished, my lord." She carefully cut the thread. She placed the scissors back into her wooden box. She stood up slowly. Her legs were stiff from kneeling. "The cloak is mended." She stepped back from the bench. She kept her hands clasped in front of her patched dress. Jaden did not inspect the cloak. He simply stared at her. He saw the exhaustion deeply etched into her youthful face. He saw the desperate pride keeping her standing straight. He turned around and walked back toward his table. Emily's heart sank. She waited for him to dismiss her without payment. It had happened before with lesser lords. Jaden reached into a leather pouch on his belt. He pulled out a silver coin. He tossed it onto the wooden table. It landed with a sharp clink next to the tray of meat. "Your payment," Jaden said. Emily exhaled a shaky breath of relief. She walked toward the table. Every step felt heavy. She reached out and took the silver coin. It felt cold and solid in her palm. "Thank you," she said softly. She turned to leave. She was desperate to escape the intoxicating smell of the food. She took 3 steps toward the heavy oak doors. "Wait," Jaden said. Emily stopped instantly. She did not turn around. Fear gripped her chest again. Had he found a flaw in the stitching? Did he want the coin back? She slowly turned to face him. Jaden was still standing by the table. He gestured to the empty wooden chair opposite him. The firelight danced across his hardened features. "It is dark outside," he stated plainly. He looked down at the roasted meat. He looked back up at her. "Stay for supper." Emily stared at him in pure shock. She could not process the command. The Alpha King did not dine with peasant seamstresses. The silence stretched between them. The wind howled against the stone wall outside, reminding them both of the freezing night. Emily stood frozen near the heavy oak doors. The wind battered the stone walls outside with renewed fury. She looked from the dark wood of the door back to the roaring hearth. Jaden remained standing by the long table. He did not repeat his invitation. He merely waited for her decision. Her pride warred bitterly with her empty stomach. Pride offered no warmth against the coming blizzard. She slowly walked back toward the fire. Her worn boots made no sound against the stone floor. She stopped beside the empty wooden chair. It was carved from dark oak and felt too grand for her small frame. "Sit," Jaden said. He sat down in his own chair at the head of the table. Emily lowered herself onto the very edge of the wooden seat. She kept her back perfectly straight. She folded her hands tightly in her lap. The tray of roasted lamb sat directly between them. The heat radiating from the meat warmed her face. Jaden picked up the iron knife. He sliced a thick piece of meat. He slid a wooden trencher across the table toward her. He placed the sliced meat onto her trencher. He then tore a large chunk from the crusty loaf of bread. He dropped the bread next to the meat. "Eat," he instructed quietly. Emily stared at the food. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bread. She tore a very small piece from the crust. She placed it in her mouth and chewed slowly. The rich flavor nearly brought tears to her eyes. She swallowed hard and forced herself not to devour the meal instantly. Hunger urged her to tear into the meat with her bare hands. Dignity forced her to use the small iron fork resting on the table. She cut a modest piece of lamb. She tasted the salt and the warm fat. It was the best thing she had eaten in years. Jaden watched her in silence. He cut his own portion of meat and ate methodically. He noticed how she kept her elbows tucked close to her sides. She took up as little physical space as possible. She acted like prey trying to hide in plain sight. He found her extreme caution both irritating and intriguing, Most people flattered him or cowered visibly in his presence. Emily did neither. She simply endured her reality. The great hall remained quiet except for the crackling fire. The warmth of the room slowly seeped into Emily's bones. Her physical trembling finally stopped. She finished her single slice of meat. She wiped her mouth gently with the back of her hand. She immediately realized her poor manners and lowered her hand. Jaden pushed the tray slightly closer to her. "There is more," he said. Emily shook her head gently. "I have had enough, thank you." It was a lie. She was still painfully hungry, but she did not want to appear greedy. Jaden knew she was lying. He did not press the issue. He reached for the heavy wine pitcher resting near the fire. He grabbed the thick clay handle. As he lifted the pitcher, his grip slipped slightly. A sharp hiss escaped his lips. Emily looked up in sudden surprise. Jaden set the pitcher down hard on the table. He rubbed the back of his right hand. Emily noticed a deep, jagged scar running across his knuckles. The bitter cold weather had caused the old skin to crank open. A thin line of fresh blood welled up along the broken seam. It smeared against his thumb as he flexed his fingers. Jaden ignored the blood and reached for the pitcher again. "You are bleeding," Emily said. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Jaden paused. He looked at his hand indifferently. "It is nothing." He poured the dark wine into a metal cup. The blood smeared against the rim of the cup. Emily watched the red drop trail down his skin. She thought about the brutal cold outside these walls. She knew how easily a small wound could fester and rot in winter. She reached into the deep pocket of her patched dress. Her fingers found a small square of folded cloth. It was made of coarse linen, but it was entirely clean. She had washed it with melted snow just that morning. She pulled the cloth from her pocket. She stood up slightly from her wooden chair. She leaned across the wide table. She held out the folded linen toward him. Jaden looked at the plain cloth. He looked up at her face. Her eyes held no fear or hidden calculation. They only held a quiet, genuine concern. "Take it," Emily urged softly. She pushed the cloth a little closer to his scarred hand. "The cold will make the wound angry." Jaden stared at her outstretched arm. Her skin was pale and heavily marked with needle pricks. She was offering him her own meager possession. He was a sovereign king who commanded entire armies. He possessed iron chests filled with gold and fine silk. Yet, this starving girl was trying to care for him. He slowly reached out across the table. He took the linen cloth from her thin fingers. Their hands brushed for a mere fraction of a second. Her skin felt incredibly soft despite the harsh weather. He pressed the cloth against his bleeding knuckles. The rough fabric stung the open cut, but it absorbed the blood quickly. Emily sat back down in her chair. She folded her hands tightly in her lap once more. "Thank you," Jaden said. His voice was distinctly lower than before. It lacked the sharp edge of military command. Emily nodded simply. She kept her eyes focused respectfully on the wooden table. Jaden kept the cloth pressed firmly to his hand. He realized the great hall did not feel as desolate as usual. The physical presence of this quiet woman altered the space. He looked at the perfectly mended cloak resting on the bench. He looked at the empty trencher sitting in front of her. He made a sudden, uncharacteristic decision. He reached into his leather pouch again. He pulled out a second silver coin. He slid it across the wooden table. It stopped just inches from her folded hands. Emily looked at the coin in deep confusion. "My lord, you have already paid me." Jaden picked up his wine cup with his left hand. The first coin was for the cloak. He took a slow drink of the dark wine. The second coin is for a new task. Emily looked up, her confusion deepening into worry. "I do not understand." "My winter wardrobe is in ruins," Jaden lied smoothly. His royal tunics were in absolute perfect condition. He had 3 master tailors on permanent retainer in the capital. "I require someone to mend the rest of my heavy garments." Emily stared at him. "Surely the castle has skilled tailors on staff." "They are completely busy preparing canvas for the spring campaign." Jaden set his metal cup down on the table. "You work quickly and quietly." He pointed toward the heavy wooden doors. "The roads are closed by the deep snow anyway." He met her gaze directly. "You will stay in the fortress until the work is fully done." Emily's heart hammered painfully against her ribs. She had no food or firewood left at her tiny village hut. Returning home meant facing the brutal freeze entirely alone. Staying here meant physical safety, steady warmth, and secure work. But it also meant sleeping under the same roof as the most dangerous man in the kingdom. She looked down at the bright silver coin on the table. She thought about the howling wind rattling the glass windows. "Where will I sleep?" she asked cautiously. Jaden recognized the quiet acceptance in her tone. "The head housekeeper will find you a warm room near the kitchens." He stood up from the long table. "You begin your work tomorrow morning." He turned and walked away from the table. He headed toward the dark stone stairs at the back of the great hall. He carried her small linen cloth with him in his hand. Emily sat alone in the large, fire-lit hall. She looked at the 2 silver coins shining against the dark wood. She had come here expecting careless cruelty or swift dismissal. She had found an unexpected sanctuary instead. She reached out and picked up the second coin. It felt just as heavy and real as the first one. She closed her cold fingers tightly around the warm silver. The fire crackled steadily in the stone hearth. For the first time in months, she did not feel the biting cold. Morning light filtered through the small, high window. Emily opened her eyes and stared at the stone ceiling. She lay still for a long moment. She waited for the familiar ache of the freezing cold. The cold never came. The thick woolen blankets trapped her body heat perfectly. She sat up and rubbed her face. A small fire burned steadily in the iron grate across the room. The head housekeeper had assigned her this modest chamber near the kitchens. It smelled faintly of dried herbs and baked bread. Emily dressed quickly in her worn garments. She washed her face with warm water from a ceramic basin. She made her way back to the great hall. The massive room was busier than it had been the previous night. Servants swept the stone floors and polished the wooden tables. Jaden sat at his usual place by the main hearth. He was speaking quietly with 2 older military commanders. Emily kept her head down and walked to the wooden bench. A heavy pile of dark garments waited for her. She opened her wooden sewing box and prepared her needle. She picked up a torn linen shirt and examined the frayed edges. Her hands moved with practiced speed. The dull hum of political discussions provided a steady background noise. Nobody paid attention to the quiet woman sewing in the corner. Emily preferred the anonymity. It allowed her to focus entirely on earning her silver coins. 2 hours passed in comfortable silence. The commanders eventually bowed and left the hall. Jaden remained at his table reading a stack of parchment letters. He occasionally glanced toward the bench. Emily was hunched over a thick leather vest. She used a sharp awl to pierce the tough hide before threading the needle. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Heavy footsteps echoed loudly from the entryway. A tall soldier marched into the great hall. He wore chainmail and carried a snow-covered helmet at his arm. His boots left dirty puddles on the clean stone. He looked around the room and spotted Emily. He walked directly toward her bench. Emily paused her stitching and looked up nervously. The soldier carried a heavy canvas tent flap. It was slashed down the middle and caked in frozen mud. He dropped the foul-smelling canvas right at her feet. Dust and dirt scattered across her neat work area. "Fix this," the soldier demanded loudly. His voice was rough and held an obvious layer of contempt. Emily looked at the filthy canvas. "I am sorry, sir," she said softly. She kept her voice as polite as possible. "I was hired to mend the Lord's personal garments." The soldier scoffed and crossed his arms. "You are a hired hand, eating our food." He kicked the canvas closer to her boots. "You will fix the camp tents, just like the other servants." Emily swallowed hard. She did not want to cause any trouble. She reached down to pick up the heavy fabric. "Leave it." The deep voice cut through the air like a physical blade. The soldier stiffened instantly and spun around. Jaden stood up from his table. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the iron sword at his hip. He simply walked slowly toward the soldier. The atmosphere in the room grew suffocatingly dense. The soldier lowered his head and took a step back. "My lord," the soldier stammered. Jaden stopped 2 feet away from the man. He looked down at the dirty canvas on the floor. He then looked at the mud tracked across the clean stone. "Did I issue an order regarding the tents?" Jaden asked. His tone was dangerously calm. The soldier broke out in a cold sweat. "No, my lord." "Did you consult my quartermaster before delegating tasks in my hall?" The soldier swallowed loudly. "I did not, my lord." Jaden shifted his gaze to the soldier's face. His blue eyes were utterly devoid of warmth. "You track filth into my hall." He pointed a scarred finger at the canvas. "You throw garbage at my seamstress." He let the word hang in the silent room. "You presume to speak for me." The soldier dropped to one knee. His armor clattered against the stone floor. "Forgive me," the soldier pleaded. Emily clutched her sewing tools tightly against her chest. She had never seen a large man cower so pitifully. Jaden looked down at the kneeling man with clear disgust. "Pick up the canvas," Jaden ordered. The soldier scrambled to gather the heather fabric into his arms. "Report to the outer wall." Jaden turned his back on the man. "You will take the night watch for the next month." The soldier bowed his head quickly. "Yes, my lord." He rushed out of the hall without looking back. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him. The room fell quiet again. Jaden looked at the dirt scattered on the floor near Emily's bench. He motioned for a servant hiding near the stairs. "Clean this," he instructed briefly. The servant hurried forward with a broom. Jaden turned his attention back to Emily. She was staring at him with wide, cautious eyes. She slowly lowered her sewing tools into her lap. "Thank you," she whispered. Jaden noticed her pale fingers gripping the fabric. He hated the fear lingering in her posture. "You do not take orders from the garrison," he stated firmly. He closed the distance between them. He stopped near the wooden bench. "You answer only to me." Emily nodded slowly. She understood the gravity of his words. He was drawing a protective circle around her. It was a strange feeling. She was accustomed to being entirely invisible. Society had always treated her as a disposable burden. Yet this powerful man demanded respect for her presence. Jaden looked down at the tough leather vest in her hands. "That hide is too thick for a standard needle," he observed. Emily looked down at her work. "I have an awl," she replied. She showed him the small metal tool. "It is slow work, but it gets the job done." Jaden shook his head slightly. "You will ruin your hands before evening." He reached into his own tunic. He pulled out a small, leather-wrapped package. He held it out to her. Emily hesitated before taking it. She unwrapped the soft leather carefully. Inside lay a set of fine bone needles and a silver thimble. The tools were masterfully crafted. They belonged to an artisan, not a village seamstress. They were left behind by a traveling merchant, Jaden lied. He had actually confiscated them from a corrupt supply master years ago. Use them. Emily touched the smooth surface of the silver thimble. It fit her finger perfectly. These are very valuable, she said softly. She looked up at him. I cannot accept such a gift. It is not a gift, Jaden countered smoothly. It is an investment in your work. He turned and walked back to his table. He picked up his parchment letters. I expect perfection from my staff. Emily watched him sit down in his heavy wooden chair. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. She recognized the gentle lie hiding behind his stern command. She placed the silver thimble on her finger. She threaded the fine bone needle. It pierced the thick leather with incredible ease. The pain in her fingers immediately lessened. She resumed her work with renewed energy. The great hall no longer felt vast and intimidating. The crackling fire sounded like a cheerful melody. Jaden continued reading his letters. He did not look up again. He simply listened to the steady, rhythmic sound of her sewing. The blizzard raged outside the stone walls. Inside, the fortress felt surprisingly peaceful. The afternoon hours slipped away unnoticed. The harsh gray light outside the window slowly faded into dusk. Servants entered the hall to light the iron wall sconces. Emily stretched her tired neck and rubbed her shoulders. She had repaired 4 heavy tunics and the leather vest. She neatly folded the finished garments and stacked them on the bench. She carefully cleaned her new bone needles and wrapped them in leather. She placed the tools back into her wooden box. Jaden signed the final parchment and pushed his inkwell aside. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked across the room. "Are you finished for the day?" he asked. His voice broke the long stretch of silence comfortably. Emily stood up and smoothed her skirt. "I am, my lord." She gestured to the neat stack of clothing. "They are ready." Jaden did not inspect the work. "Leave them." He stood up and stretched his broad shoulders. "The kitchens will be serving supper soon." Emily hesitated for a moment. She wondered if she should retreat to her small room. She did not want to overstep her bounds. "You will eat here," Jaden added casually. He read the uncertainty on her face easily. "I dislike eating in an empty hall." Emily nodded. She walked slowly toward the long wooden table. She sat in the same chair she had used the previous night. It felt slightly less imposing this time. Jaden sat opposite her. A servant arrived quickly with 2 steaming bowls of thick stew. He placed a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water between them. The servant left without a word. Emily picked up her wooden spoon. She ate slowly and savored the rich taste of root vegetables and beefs. She no longer felt the desperate panic of starvation. She felt full and surprisingly safe. Jaden watched her eat in quiet contentment. He noticed the silver thimble still resting on the table near her hand. He reached for his glass of water. He realized he was actually looking forward to tomorrow. The blizzard raged for 3 unbroken days. Snow piled high against the lower fortress windows. The great hall became a warm sanctuary against the desolate world outside. Emily worked steadily through the towering pile of heavy winter garments. She established a quiet routine within the stone walls. She woke with the dawn and sewed until the firelight faded. Jaden was a constant presence at his long wooden table. He governed his harsh territory while she mended his armor undergarments. They rarely spoke during the busy daylight hours. Their shared silence had grown comfortable rather than oppressive. On the 4th afternoon, Emily reached the bottom of the unwashed laundry basket. Her fingers brushed against something entirely different from the rough wool and hardened leather. She pulled out a small piece of fabric. It was a child's cloak, woven from fine, dark thread. The edges were badly charred and brittle from old fire damage. A deep, jagged rip tore right through the center of the tiny garment. Emily stared at the ruined cloth. It was far too small for any soldier in the garrison. It held the distinct smell of old ash and deep sorrow. She laid the fragile fabric onto her wooden bench. She ran her fingers gently over the burned edges. Someone had carefully folded and preserved this ruined thing for decades. She threaded her bone needle with the finest black silk she possessed. She leaned close to the fabric and began to carefully stitch the jagged tear. Heavy footsteps abruptly halted near her bench. "What are you doing?" Jaden's voice cracked through the quiet hall like a physical whip. Emily gasped and dropped her hands into her lap. She looked up to find him towering over her workspace. His blue eyes were wide and locked onto the tiny cloak. A dark, dangerous fury rolled off his broad shoulders. He stepped forward and snatched the small garment from the bench. "Who told you to touch this?" he demanded. His tone held a raw edge of panic she had never heard before. Emily pressed her back against the cold stone wall. "It was in the bottom of the basket, my lord." She kept her voice remarkably steady despite her racing heart. "I thought it required mending like the rest of the pile." Jaden clutched the charred fabric against his wide chest. His knuckles turned white from the sheer force of his grip. He looked like a wounded animal backed into a dark corner. He was the sovereign ruler of the North, yet this small piece of cloth reduced him to a defensive survivor. "It does not require mending," he stated harshly. He glared down at her pale face. "You overstep your boundaries." He turned away abruptly. He walked quickly toward the roaring hearth. Emily watched him stand before the tall flames. He stared into the fire with impossibly rigid shoulders. He looked utterly isolated in the vast room. Most servants would have apologized profusely and run from the hall in terror. Emily did not run. She recognized the defensive anger masking an old, agonizing pain. She had worn that exact same mask when she lost her mother to the winter fever. She stood up slowly from her wooden bench. She walked across the stone floor toward the fire. She stopped just a few paces behind his imposing figure. The intense heat from the hearth warmed her face. "A torn thread will eventually unravel the whole garment," Emily said softly. Jaden stiffened visibly but did not turn around. "Leave me," he ordered. Emily did not retreat a single step. "My mother told me that before she died," she continued quietly. "She said we must repair what is broken before it is lost entirely." Jaden turned his head slightly. He looked at her over his broad shoulder. "Some things cannot be fixed." His voice sounded hollow and impossibly weary. Emily took one cautious step closer. She looked at the small cloak crushed in his scarred hand. "The fire took the edges," she acknowledged. "But the core of the weave is still very strong." She looked up into his cold blue eyes. "I was only trying to close the tear so the cold would not get in." Jaden stared at her calm, earnest face. He searched her expression for pity or morbid curiosity. He found only a profound, quiet understanding. She understood the terrible weight of carrying ancient ghosts. He slowly relaxed his tight grip on the dark fabric. The tiny cloak dropped slightly in his hand. "I was 7 years old," Jaden said. The words seemed to cost him a great deal of physical effort. Emily remained perfectly still and listened. Rival warlords burned our ancestral estate to the ground. He looked back into the orange flames of the hearth. My father made ye in the cellar before the burning roof collapsed. He lifted the charred cloth slightly toward the light. This was all I managed to drag out of the heavy ashes. Emily felt a sharp, empathetic ache in her own chest. She understood now why the mighty king never lost a battle. He fought every war as if his childhood home was still burning. She reached out her hand slowly. She stopped midway, offering him the silent choice to pull away. Jaden watched her hand hover in the open space between them. He did not move back. Emily gently placed her fingers over his scarred hand holding the cloak. Her touch was feather-light and completely devoid of threat. "You survived the fire," Emily whispered. She gently tugged on the edge of the fabric. "Let me finish closing the tear." Jaden looked down at their touching hands. Her small, pale fingers looked incredibly fragile against his hardened skin. Yet, her gentle grip felt remarkably steady and grounding. He slowly released his firm hold on the old garment. Emily took the child's cloak back to her wooden bench. She sat down and smoothed the fabric carefully across her knees. She picked up her fine bone needle again. Jaden did not return to his large table. He walked over and stood beside her low bench. He watched her work in complete silence. Her stitches were tiny, meticulous, and incredibly strong. She used the black silk to bind the frayed edges of the tear together. The dark thread blended seamlessly with the original ancient weave. The jagged hole slowly disappeared under her highly skilled hands. It took nearly an hour to finish the delicate repair process. The hall was utterly quiet, except for the wind howling outside the walls. Emily finally snipped the end of the silk thread with her iron scissors. She smoothed the closed seam with her thumb. She held the tiny cloak up to the warm firelight. The garment was still deeply scarred by the ancient fire. The dark burn marks remained completely untouched. However, the deep tear that split the center was entirely gone. The fabric was functionally whole again. She folded the cloak neatly. She turned and handed it up to Jaden. He took it from her with surprising physical gentleness. He ran his thumb over the nearly invisible seam. It felt remarkably smooth and secure against his rough skin. He looked down at the quiet woman sitting on the bench. She was carefully packing her fine bone needles back into their leather wrap. She did not demand thanks or expect any kind of reward. She had simply offered her skill to ease a pain she clearly recognized. "You are highly skilled," Jaden finally said. Emily closed the lid of her wooden box. "Hunger makes a fast learner, my lord." Jaden frowned slightly at her brutal, practical honesty. He hated the sudden thought of her starving in a freezing village hut. He hated the idea of her leaving when the snow finally melted. He walked back to his long wooden table. He placed the folded child's cloak carefully next to his parchment maps. He did not hide it away in the dark this time. "The blizzard is breaking," Jaden noted. He looked toward the high stone window. The howling wind had dropped to a low, steady moan. "The main roads will be clear in 2 days." Femel felt a sudden, sharp drop in her stomach. Her time in this warm sanctuary was rapidly coming to an end. She had successfully repaired all the heavy garments in the basket. Her temporary purpose here was strictly fulfilled. "I will gather my things tomorrow morning," Emily said quietly. She kept her eyes firmly fixed on the gray stone floor. "I have earned enough silver to survive the rest of the bitter winter." Jaden sat down heavily in his wooden chair. He watched her staring at the cold floor. He recognized the familiar, painful resignation in her defeated posture. She fully expected to be cast out into the unforgiving cold again. He leaned forward and rested his muscular arms on the table. "The fortress is vast," Jaden stated casually. My ancestral tapestries are severely fraying. He picked up his metal wine cup and inspected the rim. The heavy winter drapes in the upper corridors require extensive structural reinforcement. Emily looked up slowly. She blinked in pure, undisguised confusion. My lord? Your work is barely adequate, Jaden lied with a perfectly straight face. Her work was actually nothing short of a miracle. I require a permanent seamstress on my personal staff. Emily stopped breathing entirely for a long second. A permanent position in the main keep meant reliable, steady wages. It meant a warm bed, daily meals, and absolute physical safety. It was a level of security a village orphan could not even properly dream of. You would hire me permanently? She asked. Her voice wavered slightly, betraying her desperate hidden hope. I would, Jaden confirmed firmly. He set his metal cup down on the dark wood. The position pays 4 silver coins a month. He met her wide, disbelieving blue eyes. You will also receive full daily provisions and keep your current heated chamber. Emily clutched her pale hands together tightly in her lap. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she firmly refused to let them fall. I accept the position, my lord, she managed to say. I will not disappoint you. Jaden leaned back in his chair. A heavy, unseen weight instantly lifted from his broad shoulders. The thought of the great hall returning to its former crushing emptiness had troubled him deeply. See that you do not, he replied softly. He picked up his stack of parchment letters once again. Emily sat back down on her wooden bench. She rested her hands calmly on her lap. The suffocating fear of the coming winter had completely vanished from her mind. She looked across the large room at the imposing ruler. He was no longer just a terrifying, untouchable warlord to her. He was a man who carefully preserved a burned cloak to remember his roots. He was a man who quietly offered sanctuary under the practical guise of employment. The fire crackled merrily in the large stone hearth. The dark, imposing fortress finally felt like a real home. The heavy oak doors swung open to reveal a blindingly white landscape. The long blizzard had finally broken. Pale sunlight poured into the gloomy stone hall. Soldiers shouted sharp orders in the frozen courtyard outside. They worked tirelessly to clear the massive snowdrifts blocking the gates. Emily sat in her usual corner near the roaring hearth. She was diligently reinforcing the seams of a heavy wool blanket. Jaden studied a wide parchment map at his long wooden table. The peaceful morning routine shattered when 4 soldiers stomped heavily into the room. They brought a bitter draft of winter air with them. The lead soldier carried a small bundle wrapped in a coarse gray blanket. He stepped forward and set the bundle gently onto a wooden bench. The thick wool fell away to reveal a young boy. He looked no older than 6 years. His ragged clothes were soaked through with melted snow. He shivered violently against the hard wood. We found him near the western pass, the soldier reported. Jaden looked up from his scattered maps. Explain the situation, Jaden demanded. His settlement was buried under an avalanche during the final night of the storm. The soldier looked down at the boy with awkward pity. He was wandering along the tree line looking for shelter. Jaden walked slowly toward the bench. He stood over the shivering child in silence. The boy shrank back against the rough backrest. He stared at Jaden's scarred face with wide, terrified eyes. The child had clearly survived a terrible ordeal. The objective cruelty of the harsh winter had spared his life, but stolen his home. Jaden felt a familiar, dull ache tight in his chest. He remembered the bitter cold of his own childhood tragedy. Emily jabbed her bone needle directly onto her lap. She stood up and hurried across the cold stone floor. She pushed past the armed soldiers without a single hesitation. She knelt carefully in front of the small boy. "Bring me a warm basin of water and a clean towel," Emily ordered the nearest guard. The soldier blinked, in genuine surprise at her sudden tone of authority. He looked toward Jaden for official confirmation. Jaden gave a short, sharp nod. The soldier rushed quickly toward the castle kitchens. Emily reached out and gently touched the boy's frozen hands. His skin felt icy and worryingly pale. "What is your name?" she asked softly. Her tone was calm and remarkably steady. She did not use a high-pitched or childish voice. She spoke to him with quiet, solemn respect. The boy sniffled and rubbed his dirty cheek. "Leo," he whispered into the quiet hall. "You are safe now, Leo," Emily assured him. She unwrapped his sodden, freezing outer tunic. She pulled her own dry woolen shawl from her shoulders. She wrapped it securely around his small, trembling frame. The soldier returned quickly with a steaming ceramic basin and a folded linen cloth. Emily took the cloth and dipped it into the warm water. She carefully washed the frozen mud from Leo's small face. She cleaned his raw hands with slow, deliberate motions. Jaden watched the scene unfold in profound silence. He saw the natural, unhesitating grace in her movements. She was offering this broken orphan the exact same unconditional care she had offered him. She possessed nothing of material value, yet she freely gave away her own warmth to comfort another wounded soul. "The village orphanage is a day's ride south," the lead soldier suggested bluntly. "We can take him there when the main road fully clears." Emily paused her gentle washing. Her hand hovered motionless over the warm basin. She knew the grim reality of village orphanages during the brutal winter months. Food was always scarce and heavily rationed. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, unheated buildings. A traumatized boy like Leo would rarely survive until the spring thaw. She looked up directly at Jaden. She did not speak a single word of protest. Her blue eyes held a desperate, silent plea. She was begging the powerful ruler for simple mercy. Jaden looked from Emily's pleading face to the shivering boy. Leo was clutching Emily's woolen shawl tightly in his small fists. The child pressed his face against her side for physical comfort. He instinctively sought her gentle presence for protection against the armored men. Jaden turned to gaze back to the lead soldier. "The roads are still too dangerous for civilian travel," Jaden stated flatly. "He will not survive the rough journey south." The soldier frowned in obvious confusion. "Then what shall we do with him, my lord?" Jaden looked back at Emily. A silent, heavy understanding passed between them. "He stays here," Jaden commanded. The soldiers exchanged bewildered glances with one another. The northern fortress was a strict military garrison. It was no place for a soft, wandering child to live. "Where will he sleep?" the soldier dared to ask. "He will sleep in the seamstress's quarters," Jaden answered smoothly. He stepped closer to the wooden bench. "She will be responsible for his daily care." Emily let out a long, shuddering breath of profound relief. A radiant, genuine smile broke across her tired face. It was the first time Jaden had ever seen her truly smile. The subtle beauty of it caught him entirely off guard. He felt a strange, warm flutter deep in his chest. "Thank you," Emily whispered softly. Jaden offered a brief, subtle nod. He turned to address the waiting soldiers again. "Dismissed." The armored men bowed swiftly and left the great hall. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. The vast room returned to its peaceful quiet. Emily lifted Leo into her arms with practiced ease. The boy was worryingly light. He rested his tired head against her shoulder and closed his eyes. "I will take him to my room and find him some dry clothes," Emily said. She looked down at his dirty, worn leather boots. "He needs a hot meal to restore his strength. Jaden gestured toward the far hallway leading to the domestic wing. The kitchen staff will provide whatever you require for his recovery. Emily carried the sleeping boy toward the dark stone corridor. She moved slowly to avoid waking him from his exhausted slumber. Jaden watched them disappear into the long shadows. He walked back to his table and sat down heavily in his chair. He picked up his metal quill to resume Rahim's military orders. His mind fiercely refused to focus on troop formations and supply lines. He kept seeing the gentle way Emily had wrapped her shawl around the freezing boy. He kept remembering the deep gratitude shining in her eyes. She had looked at him as a steadfast protector, not a monster. He set the metal quill down on the parchment. He rubbed the old, jagged scar across his knuckles. The great hall felt distinctly different this morning. It was no longer just a cold command center for a ruthless war. It felt like something fragile and precious was taking root within the ancient stone walls. An hour later, Emily returned to the main hall. She did not bring her wooden sewing box this time. She held Leo firmly by his small hand. The boy wore a clean linen shirt that belonged to a servant. The sleeves were rolled up high past his small elbows. His face was scrubbed clean, and his dark hair was neatly combed. He looked deeply tired, but remarkably calm. Emily led him slowly toward the roaring fire. "He is afraid of the dark room," she explained apologetically. "He asked to stay out here near the light." Jaden studied the small boy from his seat. "Sit by the fire," Jaden instructed softly. His deep voice startled the child slightly. Leo hid quickly behind Emily's patched skirt. Emily patted his head reassuringly with her soft hand. She guided him to the warm stone hearth. She sat down on the floor beside him. A servant soon arrived carrying a tray of warm chicken broth and soft bread. Emily took a wooden spoon and fed the boy patiently. Leo swallowed the warm liquid with eager hunger. Jaden observed the steady, comforting rhythm of her care. He watched her tear the bread into tiny, manageable pieces. She murmured quiet words of encouragement between every bite. The boy slowly relaxed his tense shoulders. He began to lean into her warmth with genuine trust. Emily finished feeding him and set the empty bowl aside. She pulled a small measuring string from her pocket. She carefully measured the width of the boy's narrow shoulders. She looked across the room at the imposing ruler. "My lord," Emily began hesitantly. Jaden met her gaze and waited for her request. "He has no warm clothes of his own." She gestured to the oversized linen shirt. "May I use the discarded fabric in the storeroom to fashion him a proper tunic?" Jaden leaned back in his heavy oak chair. He thought about the massive bolts of fine wool locked away in the lower vaults. "Take whatever material you need," Jaden commanded gently. He pointed toward the heavy wooden chest near the stairs. "There is deep blue wool in that trunk." He held her surprised gaze. "It is dense enough to block the winter wind." Emily nodded with quiet, immense gratitude. She knew the blue wool was highly expensive and meant only for office